Continuação da leitura do livro The New Map. É o capítulo 20, a leitura segue em inglês. Chapter 20. Count on the wisdom of following generations. In previous decades, flare-ups over the South China Sea receded as a nation in the region focused on economic growth. For no country was that truer than for China, with its 10% or more annual economic growth and what it would call its peaceful rise. And peace was the absolute necessity to allow such growth and China's expanding role in the global economy. Deng Xiaoping knew from all his life experience the costs of war and upheaval. Paramount leader for 2 decades, Deng masterminded China's move towards the market and its integration with the world economy. Once one of Mao's most important lieutenants, he had been purged twice. That gave him ample time, first during years of exile and as a laborer in the tractor factory, and then under house arrest in Mao's later years, to reflect on what had gone wrong with the revolution. He witnessed the huge, tragic cost and massive waste of Mao's grand schemes and personally suffered from Mao's rule and cultural revolution. His son, thrown out a window by fanatic young Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. He was left permanently paralyzed in a wheelchair. By nature, Deng was a pragmatic problem solver. While working as a communist propagandist during his student days in France, he had also run a Chinese restaurant. Later in life, he said that he had never actually read Karl Marx Das Kapital in full because he didn't have the time. Although then he said to have once told the Vietnamese that the South China Sea islands have belonged to China since ancient times, he also laid out a strategy for dealing with the issue. This generation is not wise enough to settle such a difficult issue. It would be an idea to count on the wisdom of the following generations to settle it. He had conveyed the same idea on the East China Sea. Better was his message, to let people get on with their lives and expand their economies and raise their incomes. In 2002, China and ASEAN, the 10-member Association of the Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, had worked out the outlines for the code of conduct that pointed to a pragmatic resolution. Deng's approach was what has been called ambiguity of all fronts, was more or less working until 2009. In March of that year, Chinese naval and air forces and fishing boats intersected a U.S. Navy ship, USS Impeccable, which was tracking Chinese naval operations about 75 miles off the island of Hainan. Here was the clash over the concept of EEZ. This was well outside China's 12 miles of territorial waters, though within its exclusive economic zone. To the United States, these were open waters. To China, they were under Chinese suzerainty. Chinese naval vessels ordered the Impeccable to leave. At one point, the Impeccable executed a direct stop to avoid a collision. 2 months later, in May 2009, in response to a dispute over the sea with Vietnam and Malaysia, China delivered a note verbal to the United Nations declaring its undisputable sovereignty over the islands of South China Sea and the adjacent waters. Of special significance in the note was a short parenthetical phrase that was anything but parenthetical in importance. See attached map, and then that was the 9-dash line map, based on Bai Shi Meishu in 1936 map, officially introduced as part of a legal document and a key moment in the game of maps. In 2009, almost exactly a month later, a Chinese nuclear submarine collided with a sonar array being towed by the USS John S. McCain, named for the senator's father, and the American ship was participating in naval exercises with 6 Southeast Asian countries. A new era of contention had begun for the South China Sea. In July 2010, the ASEAN nations were holding their 17th Regional Forum, and this time in Hanoi, hosted by Vietnam, and a few months earlier, some Chinese officials and strategists had begun to describe the South China Sea as a core interest. Those were highly significant words, for they were the same formulation applied to the ultra-important questions of Tibet and Taiwan, and they could be interpreted as fighting words. Core interests had generated pushback from the United States and set off alarms for Southeast Asian countries. Prior to the meeting, several of them, including Vietnam, had urged the United States to say something strong on the subject at Hanoi meeting. And that is exactly what Secretary of State Hillary Clinton intended to do. In her speech, Clinton said that while the United States did not take sides on the specific question of sovereignty, the impasse should be solved on a multilateral basis, preserving unfettered access to the South China Sea. The United States, like every nation, she said, has a national interest in freedom of navigation, open access to Asia's maritime commons, and respect for international law in the South China Sea. National interest had been a carefully chosen phrase, as Clinton later said, as a riposte to the core interest emanation from Beijing. As Clinton finished her speech, Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi was as Clinton observed, livid, like very angry. He asked for an hour adjournment and then returned. He was still furious. Clinton's remarks, he declared in English, were virtually an attack on China. Looking right at Clinton, he warned against outside interference. Nobody was threatening the region's peace and stability. The United States, he seemed to be saying, was conspiring against China. Then, fixing his eyes on Singapore's foreign minister, he intoned, "China is a big country, and other countries are small countries, and that is just a fact." Yang then turned his gaze directly to Vietnam's foreign minister, who was chair of the meeting, and said to him, "We, socialists, must stand together." Vietnam's foreign minister said nothing. The room was quiet. After further reflection, the foreign minister came up with a diplomatic response. "It is time for lunch," he said. "Let's go to lunch." But what was left on the table was the jarring juxtaposition of interests, China's core interests versus the United States' national interests. This was chapter 20.